Afternoon, good evening to you all. I welcome you to today's webinar featuring Dr. Tsolin Nalbantian on the Lebanonization of Armenians. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Melanie Tanilian, the current director of the Center of Armenian Studies at the University of Michigan. And before we begin, I would like, as always, thank our program specialist, Naira Tumanian, for working so tirelessly behind the scenes to make these conversations possible. Then I think it must also be said that the situation in Armenia continues to be concerning, and looking on from afar for many, of course, is no doubt mentally straining on top of our general state of exhaustion. The theme of our programming this semester, displacement and deviation, of course, is taking on a whole another dimension and meaning as the Armenian military and countless civilians are forced to leave their homes along the single road through the mountainous territory that connects Kelbajar to Armenia. And this is only, I guess, the beginning, as other territories are scheduled to be turned over to Azerbaijan later this month, and the fate of the remaining territories, as well as the cultural heritage sites, remains to be ambiguous. And of course, the most recent announcement that the Turkish military will dispatch troops to join Russian peacekeeping forces on the ground is nothing but alarming. What is clear is that this is a story of loss and a story of Armenians yet again being displaced, as nothing in the lives of those families will ever be the same. The great deviation from what was and what will be, of course, is shrouded in great uncertainty. What might we do as a community? I think at this point, it's about aiding those who have lost everything. And there are a number of organizations, of course, that can use our financial help. And a list of those may be found on the website of the United Nations Refugee Agency. And I will post that a link into the chat. How to recover, how to adjust to a new place of residence, how to find a job. What schools should children go to? Where does one find an apartment? How does one feed their family? Access to shelter, food, education, and a life of dignity are basic human rights. Basic human rights that in their universal utopia have escaped many and are slipping through the hands of so many more as the pandemic, of course, is pushing economies to the brink of collapse. Refugees are the most vulnerable of people. And being a refugee is not unfamiliar and not an unfamiliar state of being for Armenians, as we all know. The most recent displacement is nothing but yet another moment in a long string of loss of home and possessions. But what comes after displacement? When does refuge become permanent? When does it become home? When does shelter become a part of political agency? These are the underlying questions that drive Dr. Nalbantian's work. In her talk today, she will reflect on a particular group of refugees whose displacement 100 years ago landed them in what is now Lebanon. Dr. Tsolin Nalbantian's recently published monograph, Armenians Beyond Diaspora, Making Lebanon Their Own, is the basis for today's discussion. In this outstanding historical work, she argues that in the face of the genocide and despite the absence of an independent nation state after World War I, Armenians developed a dynamic social, political, cultural, ideological, and ecclesiastical center in post-colonial Beirut of the 1940s and 50s. Herein, Dr. Nalbantian looks in particular at the political trajectory of Armenians. By examining Armenian party politics in Lebanon during the Cold War, she's able to establish Armenians who have been situated in the Lebanese historiography simply as refugees as assertive political actors. Inserting the history of minorities that are often left on the margins of national and Cold War histories, Dr. Nalbantian highlights the process with which this heterogeneous Armenian minority consolidated its power. She focuses in particular on the rhetorical strategies that on the one hand functioned to bound Armenian neighborhoods in Beirut, and on the other hand sought to assert a voice in the larger US and Soviet competition over influence in the Middle East. She does so by analyzing the Armenian Lebanese, or is a Lebanese Armenian press, and in particular the newspapers of the Dashnak, Ramgava, and Hanshak parties. Dr. Nalbantian is dialing in from the Netherlands this afternoon, where she is an assistant professor at the Leiden Institute for Area Studies at Leiden University. She has also recently held the Domanian Visiting Professor of Armenian Studies, Near Eastern Languages and Civilization at the University of Chicago. She received her PhD from the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University. And of course, besides her recent monograph that I encourage you all to read, she has widely published on the Armenian diaspora in Lebanon and overall has insisted on the inclusion of Armenians as minority populations into the historiography of the Middle East more generally. Her work, no doubt, takes on a political urgency at this moment as we see today's Armenians trekking across lands and newly imposed borders. And we are very pleased to welcome Tsolin to virtual Michigan today. And please use your Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to ask questions during the talk. And I will moderate those questions once Tsolin has ended her talk. And therewith, I will turn it now over to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Melanie. Thank you to you. Thank you for your generous introduction, to the Center for Armenian Studies for the invitation, and also to Naira Tumanyan for all your help. So hopefully I will be able to share my screen correctly. Okay, great. I think that should be working. So sort of along the same lines that Melanie started out talking to us about, thank you all for dialing in yourselves. So I have to admit, it is a little bit surreal for me to talk about Lebanon in the 1950s, given the ongoing and escalating humanitarian disaster in Qarabakh and Artsakh. Oh, sorry. I don't know why that's doing that. I'll have to stop that. Okay. Pause, sorry. I'm not very good at this Zoom thing. We don't have Zoom here in the Netherlands. We use a different interface. Anyway, so it is a little surreal for me. You know, if the topic is, of course, outside of my area of expertise, but I do think that there is a connection between Armenians in Lebanon and the Caucasus, even in the time frame I'm going to be talking about. And I think we can get to it hopefully in the Q&A. And I think the rhetoric and the language that I am going to be talking about that's employed by the Armenian press at the time will also ring a bell for you all currently. And I think it's possibly something else we can also talk about during the Q&A. So my talk today is going to highlight some themes and issues that I've been dealing with over the past few years while discussing how Armenians made Lebanon their own, following the country's independence in the 1940s and 1950s. Today, I will discuss one such case, the stance of the Armenians in the 1957 parliamentary elections and the intra-Armenian violence that took place during the larger civil strife of 1958, which resulted in the territorialization of Armenian inhabited neighborhoods in Beirut. This and other cases are discussed in my book that Melanie mentioned, Armenians Beyond Diaspora, Making Lebanon Their Own, which was published last year. And historiographically, I engage with three fields, Armenian, Lebanese, and Cold War history. I'm not going to be able to talk about that during my talk, but it's again something that we can hopefully talk about in the Q&A that follows. Despite the genocide and even after it, Armenians did know thriving centers, politically, socially, and culturally, ideologically, and ecclesiastically. Lebanon, and in particular, its capital city of Beirut, was a particularly important center. The power that Armenians articulated in the everyday in Lebanon made it an apex of Armenian authority, pulling local, regional, and transnational Armenians into its orbit. At the same time, I will show that what we can learn about Lebanon and the Arab world more broadly by looking at the everyday experiences of Armenian sociopolitics. So before I begin, I want to provide you with a hopefully brief historical background. So while the genocide condemned surviving Armenians to a life outside of Anatolia and destroyed Istanbul as the sole center of Armenian economic and cultural life, it had other effects as well. For one, Lebanon, and specifically in Beirut, the remnants of Armenian communities hailing from many points all across Anatolia, with the vast majority coming from Cilicia, gathered in a single space. So here you can see the areas where most of the Armenians came from in Lebanon. So the geography of Anatolia was radically compressed into one city, having far-reaching socio-political and cultural effects. What had been many communities in these different towns and villages back in the Ottoman Empire's lands grew into a community in Beirut. And this process was, of course, facilitated by France, Lebanon's mandate rulers, from 1918 to 1946. And the key event is in 1924, when the French included Armenian inhabitants of Lebanon in the new mandate citizenship law. So usually when this is discussed in Armenian historiography, it's seen sort of as a positive move, so to speak. But it did legally reject, or at least drastically reduce, the chance that Armenians would return to these homes back in Anatolia. After all, they were now citizens of another national space. And at the same time, citizenship created the legal and, by extension, political framework for centering and for recentering much of Armenian life in and on Lebanon. So just a quick map of the area of Lebanon and Syria. So, and thus this sort of homogenization process began. Armenians, as an official Lebanese sect, were seen through their Armenian institutions that likewise doubled as sectarian ones. Now, the presence of some of these Armenian institutions marked a distinct continuity to late Ottoman times. So the nationalist Dashnaks and the two leftist organizations, the Hunchaks and the Ramgavars, were rooted in ideologies of the late Ottoman liberal reform period. And they were concerned with Armenian conditions in the empire's peripheries, most notably in Anatolia. But the sectarianization of them was new. So Armenians embraced and participated in these processes as they aided in their articulation of power vis-à-vis other Lebanese and other Armenians. Once again, with regards to Armenian political parties, the Dashnak, the Hunchak, and the Ramgavar, and the Armenian Communist Party that had close relations to Lebanon and Syria's Communist Party, they modified their political platforms and adjusted to the new political theater of Lebanon. And given Lebanon's sectarian system, after independence, Armenians were guaranteed political power, and these four parties jockeyed with one another for it. And while I'm mentioning the specific parties, in doing so, I'm likewise including their myriad sub-organizations and affiliated institutions in Armenian economic, cultural, social, and political life. So while this process of sectarianization was regulatory, it still mixed with Armenian life that was also heterogeneous. It was more involved, it was more conflict-ridden than it had been back in Anatolia's Armenian communities. And Beirut wasn't just simply the largest concentration of Armenians in the Arab world, but as important, Beirut was the Arab East's most thriving city from the mid-19th century onward, and really provided an energizing environment for political parties, lay people, church institutions, newspapers, and eventually radio stations to interact in the everyday in different and unprecedented ways. So I'm now going to return to the actual case. So from the mid-1950s, Lebanese President Camille Chamoun, who's seated here on the right, openly pro-Western orientation created considerable political tensions in Lebanon. His divisive stance, together with increased social disparities in the wake of the Gulf oil boom and the influx of Palestinian refugees, created a toxic social, political, and economic environment in Lebanon. In this fraught situation, and in a desperate attempt to hold on to power, in 1957, he used the irregular and corrupt parliamentary elections in which his party and his allies, including the Armenian Dashnak party, triumphed to push through an unpopular bid to extend his presidency by an additional term starting the following year. While the election's outcome did not trigger violence, political rivalries hardened. The assassination of the editor of the major opposition newspaper, El Telegraph, on May 8, 1958, led to a nationwide general strike that escalated into a civil war that lasted until October. With the exception of parts of Beirut and the Mount Lebanon Governorate, Lebanon was under rebel control for 5 months. By mid-July, 15,000 US troops were present in Lebanon, backed by another 40,000 on warships of the US Navy's 6th Fleet to provide military assistance. Beirut and the airport were secured within days, essentially ending the civil strife. And negotiations to end the fighting between the government figures and the opposition were predicated upon the agreement to choose an acceptable successor to Shamoun. Fuad Shihab, the head of the Lebanese army, emerged as the best choice, garnering support from all sides of the conflict. A national pact was signed on October 17, 1958, and Armenian troops left the country by the end of October. Armenian parties participated in and contributed to the events of 1957 and 1958. Simultaneously, they used their position within the Lebanese political system to jostle for power within the Armenian community. They were Lebanized, one can say. This development turned violent and came to a close only in December 1958, almost 2 months after the Lebanese mini-civil war had ended, when the Lebanese army intervened. The Lebanese state then likewise Armenianized, in that it started to pay more attention to Armenian matters than before, intervening directly and by military force in Armenian neighborhoods by December 1958 in order to end the internecine Armenian confrontation. And while Armenians were Lebanized, they also, more than other confessions in Lebanon, were very strongly, and by 1958 mortally, internally divided along political lines. And the division was not new. It dated back to before World War II. It had been manifest in the 1946-1949 repatriation period and the 1956 Catholicos elections, 2 case studies I can also talk about during the Q&A. But it really came to a boil in 1958. And this wasn't the case only because of the general Lebanese context, so the accentuating right-left political polarization that at this point in time mapped on roughly, but by no means fully, on the country's Muslim-Christian confessional landscape. It was the case also because the Cold War, left-wing versus right-wing politics and ideologies globally was felt with particular acuity in the Armenian case, principally for the simple reason that the Soviet Union included the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic. That is, Armenia formed part of one Cold War superpower. In turn, this meant that leftist and especially communist Armenians had an especially direct connection to the Soviet Union. Vice versa, it was of supreme importance for right-wing Armenians to criticize that connection, to reject the 1920 Sovietization of Armenia, which overthrew the independent republic from 1918 to 1920 and the ruling Dashnak party, and to assert the right to speak for Armenians despite the existence of Soviet Armenia. These tensions and violent confrontations between Armenian parties and their armed men had a crucial spatial effect. They unprecedentedly territorialized parts of Beirut. So look, to be sure, parts of Lebanon were already organized by sect and class. By relative contrast, it was according to political party affiliation that in 1957-1958, many Armenians of Mar Mikhael, Sin el-Fil, Burj Hamud, and Cornish al-Nahar were resorted and relocated, often by force. This was the second time in less than a decade, especially in Beirut, the political profile of Lebanese Armenians changed considerably. So back in the repatriation period that I mentioned from 46 to 49, Tens of thousands of Armenians from Lebanon, many from Beirut, answered the USSR's call and repatriated to the Armenian Republic, to the Armenian Soviet Republic. In consequence, Armenian leftists became weaker, while the right-wing nationalist Dashnak party, affiliated with Shamoun now, grew stronger. However, until 1958, Armenian neighborhoods continued to be home to people with contrasting political convictions. Armenian political parties engaged in heated rhetoric prior to and in the aftermath of the 1957 Lebanese parliamentary elections, attacking their Armenian rivals. In the case of the nationalist Dashnak party, whose very world headquarters were in Beirut, this was done in 4 ways. First, the Dashnak mouthpiece Astag rhetorically separated Armenians from the Lebanese population as a whole to produce a space where it could attack its Armenian rivals. Second, it addressed Armenians as Lebanese, but as specific, if not marginal bloc, whose duty and consequence it was to support the Lebanese government in power, so Camille Shamoun. Third, it sought to strip anti-Dashnak Armenians from both their Armenian and Lebanese identification, turning them into foreigners who were loyal to outside powers rather than to Lebanon or the Armenian nation. And fourth, it claimed that its Armenian rivals had a history of acting immorally. So in this multi-pronged attack, Lebanon was not just some diaspora for Armenians. It became the vital center and vital site for Armenians to act out power struggles and articulate belonging. On June 4, 1957, less than a week before the parliamentary elections, Astag pleaded with its leadership to stay uninvolved in the national crisis of Lebanon and maintain that the instability in the country was temporary and would pass. This indicated that the political and social tension did not concern the Armenians in Lebanon, even though Astag self-identified Armenians as citizens of Lebanon. Not surprisingly, it did not address how this status and Astag's subsequent call for neutrality was itself a type of involvement in both the daily affairs in Lebanon and the larger political sphere. What's more, it subsequently separated Armenians from Arab citizens. So we are happy to assert that this is a quotation, we are happy to assert that the Armenians living within Lebanon's borders are aware of their responsibilities and always trust in their Arab hosts and their governments, end quote. This established a hierarchy of citizenship and designated Arabs as more authentic to Lebanon, suggesting that Armenian presence was temporary, or at least a status guaranteed by a more legitimate group. It also portrayed Armenians as indebted to both the Arabs and to the state of Lebanon. While this dismissed the potential impact of Armenians within Lebanese society, at closer look, it served a purpose. The Dashnak party used its affiliated newspaper to claim authority and power over the Armenians in Lebanon. Yes, labeling Lebanon as a host tagged belonging to another location or physical space. But in so doing, Astag also identified the Armenian inhabitants as a community and separated them from the Arab inhabitants. When warning of, quote, seditious elements intent in carrying out their threats to harm the brotherly relationship between Armenians and Arabs, end quote, it went on to designate the Dashnak party as the leader who would ensure the harmonious relationship between Armenians and Arabs. Armenians had the responsibility to uphold the authority of the Lebanese state that had been generous enough to host them, but could not participate in this Lebanese crisis. And because the Dashnak party represented only the loyal and the honorable, its opponents were clearly the contrary. This rhetoric also served the Lebanese state. The Dashnak party portrayed the community as a docile population, its rivals as potentially seditious. If this was the case, supporters of Shamoun had found their Armenian ally as his opponents had found theirs. So accusations that Hunchak and Ramgabar parties wanted to break the bond between Armenians and Arabs and destabilize Lebanon displaced ideological rivalry against Armenian parties struggling over power. Astak accused Ararat and Zartung, so its rival newspapers, to have spent over 25 years, roughly the length of time the majority of Armenians had been in Lebanon, quote, sharpening their axe against the tree of the Armenian nation. Lebanon was a site of a power struggle between competing authorities of the Armenian nation. Lebanon's contested national elections presented Armenians with an additional medium to attack one another. They used the national crisis to separate true Armenians from others and sharpened the power struggle between the Armenian parties. According to Astak, these guilty parties were, quote, once again, our city's Zartunk and Ararat newspapers, whose provocative and inflammatory news broadcasts are an invitation to go to war, end quote. Astak's claim of Beirut as our city made Beirut Armenian, affirming both Armenian belonging and Beirut as a site to articulate this belonging. The Dashnak party had no choice then but to engage with Lebanese politics. It had to do so to limit the power of its rivals and protect the Lebanese state. Astak's rivals were indeed a danger not only to Armenians in Lebanon, but rather to all Lebanese. It was in the national interest of Lebanon to defeat Dashnak party rivals. The Dashnak party also used the office of the presidency to demonstrate its superiority and reinforce its supremacy over rival Armenian parties. Its followers synchronized the platform of the party with the actions of the Lebanese president. On March 11, 1958, President Shamaoun visited the Armenian monastery at Antilias and bestowed the National Order of the Cedar, the highest medal awarded to a Lebanese civilian, upon Catholicos Sare. At the same time, the bestowal of such a prize upon the Catholicos duly served the president's and his own interests, as it showed the harmonious relationship between the president and the spiritual, cultural, and religious head of the Armenian community that extended beyond the border of Lebanon. The relationship also identified to President Shamaoun his supporters and opponents within the Armenian community. The Dashnak party also referred to how crowds reportedly lined the streets until the Antilias monastery complex to validate its stance against its rivals. The Hanchak and Ramgavar parties could not generate the same level of spectacle that Zade's supporters produced in the streets of Beirut. Astak reported that, quote, the entire way to Antilias, starting from the bridge at Dora, was decorated with the colors of the Lebanese flag. Triumphant arches were constructed along the road under which the presidential motorcade would pass on its way to Antilias. The scouts, the homeland men, so the Armenian General Athletic Union and scouts, formed in military discipline awaiting the arrival of the president at the monastery, end quote. Armenians used urban space in Beirut to mark Armenianness, which in turn supported Lebanon's sitting president. The Dashnak party continued to separate its rivals from its Armenian nation, or the Armenian nation, as the elections approached. When Hanchak and Ramgavar parties broadcast Yerevan radio stations, program to the stations in Beirut, the Dashnak party called these foreign transmissions, whose aim was to use the Armenian people to propagate a communist agenda. Its newspaper's designation of Soviet Armenia as a foreign entity and of its rivals as Soviet pawns marked Lebanon as a vital site of Armenian identity production and maintenance. So with irrefutable proof, it accused the Hanchak and Ramgavar parties of attempting to use the Armenian people as a tool to serve the communist propaganda project in the Middle East. They belong not in Lebanon, but in the Soviet Union, end quote. The end result of this distance was to de-Armenianify them. Zartunk and Ararat, Astak explained, were not even Armenian, but newspapers merely written in Armenian script. At stake here was the representation of Armenians in Lebanon. Armenian transnational connections became a liability in 1957, an opportunity for political rivals to accuse one another of loyalty to another state. While this is not a novel accusation against diaspora communities, it is not regularly one that is adopted by members of the community itself. In this way, the Dashnak party fought against this diasporic identification, associating it with disloyalty to the Armenian nation and to the Lebanese state. In an effort to claim power over its rivals, it localized Armenians and cast connections to Soviet Armenia as a problem. The insecurity present in 1957 was an opportunity for the Dashnak party to claim power through the Armenian community within the Lebanese political sphere. In turn, this meant it upheld the sectarian system of Lebanon, as it helped facilitate its own presence within its structure. In 1957, not surprisingly, the electoral triumph of the Dashnak and pro-government lists only exasperated the tension between the political parties. The continued attacks likewise demonstrated that the power struggle to articulate Armenianness belonged in Lebanon. The Dashnaks also began to link their rivals with Turkey, their perpetual enemy of the Armenian nation. Astak contended that the Hunchak and Ramgavar parties, by supporting the Soviet Union that had ties with Turkey, also bonded with Turks. This continued de-Armenianification of its rivals was necessary to consolidate the Dashnak party's power. Prior to 1958, Beirut's Armenian, Arabic, and Francophone press alike collectively described these areas as the Armenian neighborhoods. But by early 1958, the Armenian press talked of, quote unquote, the Salid Burchamud, the violent Burchamud, the suffering Cornishal Nahar. Sorry. For a minute there, I thought my children had stolen the rest of my presentation. The penetrated Hajan, a reference to the alleged Dashnak attacks, or Nur Hajan under siege. While less than a kilometer apart, these places are less than a kilometer apart, these quarters were identified as very different Armenian centers. Astak mouthpiece, the Astak mouthpiece of the Dashnak party systematically blamed and accused its rivals. In November 1958, after the Dashnak member Giray Kharimyan was murdered in Beirut, the Dashnaks immediately accused Hunchak communists for the deed. And when the Dashnak party called for a general strike and protest, it did so, but not to disrupt the Lebanese economy for sinister reasons, but to show its fellow Lebanese countrymen the danger of its Armenian rivals. Lebanon had fully transformed into a space for Armenians to battle their ideological differences. The violence continued for weeks and was so pervasive that Zartunk was forced to halt the publication of its newspaper for 3 weeks in late September, returning on October 17. By November, Hajan was completely blockaded, and the Hunchak party reported that the inhabitants were, quote, living in a quarter of fear. Lebanese officials were becoming increasingly involved in the violence between Armenian political parties and their affiliates. Elite security forces were stationed in the Armenian populated neighborhoods to prevent further unrest. Prime Minister Rashid Karame and Minister of the Interior Raymond Adde both announced that the government would intervene and suppress any actions that undermined the public security. As Armenians were resolving their ideological differences by clashing in Beirut's Armenian neighborhoods, officials became more aware and concerned about the territorialization underway in these urban spaces. By the fall of 1958, intra-Armenian violence had become a Lebanese matter. In fact, by late 1958, intra-Armenian competition had become so intense that the Lebanese government and military was indeed ready to restore calm, was indeed needed to restore calm. Astag reported that army forces searched houses in Hajan to locate and seize weapons, making numerous arrests. While the violence between spaces continued for approximately 2 months after the larger national cessation of hostilities, they did end by December with an additional negotiation and declaration amongst Armenian parties brokered by Minister of Interior Raymond Adde. So I'll just show you the declaration of how it was printed in the press, in the Armenian press. While the Hunchak press described the conquest of the Armenian neighborhoods as complete, the new president, Fuad Shahab, did not completely forfeit his claim of authority over the Armenian community. Zartunk detailed the ongoing and intensified Lebanese military presence in Armenian neighborhoods, describing how many rooftops were occupied by the Lebanese military and that house-to-house searches were commonplace. 2 days after Eddi's proclamation, Astak reported that arrangements were underway to find a permanent resolution to, quote, the clashes that have stained the name of the Armenian nation. The Lebanese state was eventually able to placate the warring parties, demonstrating its power. Eddi's official declaration reinforced the authority of the Lebanese state by invoking the Armenian neighborhood's proximity to and in Beirut, its capital. Beirut was not to be further factionalized, or even if factionalized and polarized, the different Armenian quarters still fell under the jurisdiction of the state. Still, new facts had been created and damage had been done. Eddi's declaration also acknowledged the creation of bounded neighborhoods. His call for the immediate return of inhabitants to their own neighborhoods, and that's a quotation, contradictorily acknowledged both the separation of Armenians vis-à-vis non-Armenians in Lebanon and an internal displacement. The post-genocide story of Armenians in Lebanon was, to be sure, a story of loss and the ingathering of a very diverse population within the small urban area of Beirut, and this was quite extraordinary. But this process also helped refashion Armenian identity and power. The Lebanese case thus shows that the Armenian genocide had, and in the most traumatic and tremendously tragic way, to be certain, regenerative consequences too. The genocide ended up being more than exclusively a source of trauma and victimhood. Historians then don't need to quite treat the genocide solely as an epistemological break in the end. They can discern it, and in what followed, new starts and continuities, as well as breaks for the Armenian population hailing from the Ottoman Empire. Armenians in Lebanon created and participated in an active political life that challenges traditional representations, and perhaps more significantly, enhances our understandings of early post-colonial, early Cold War Lebanon, and the inhabitants who engaged with local, regional, and transnational powers during the period. Considering these histories necessarily frees Armenians from the marginalized periphery of history books, diasporic accounts, and nationalist renderings. It likewise reorients our gaze upon Armenians from victims to actors, irrespective of their tragic past, a statelessness, and shallow historical footprint in Lebanon. In addition, it advances the notion that Lebanon, and Beirut more specifically, was simultaneously an Armenian center as much as it has been understood as an Arab and Lebanese one. And in this way, these findings contribute to and complicate our studies of Lebanon, Beirut, and the Middle Eastern region more broadly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tsolin, for this great talk. As you know, Lebanon is close to my heart, and obviously I work at in an earlier period. And I'm going to encourage our audience to present some questions for Tsolin in the Q&A section. As we have some time to dig a little deeper, I guess, into what you're talking about. So in the beginning, you spoke a little bit about the historiography and how do you situate yourself within that. And one of the things that is so interesting to me is this sort of move to challenge this idea of being a refugee, or presenting the Armenian community as a refugee community in Lebanon, in Lebanese historiography. And I must say, if you're reading Lebanese history, Armenians don't figure very prominently into it. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how you are integrating your story into Lebanese historiography, thinking about refugees. And it's so interesting because you also talked about that within the Dajnak newspapers, the sort of term of host country is maintained, and it's also then here politically mobilized in very interesting ways. So that is my first question, and then I have more, but I also hope that our audience will chime in. But how do you fit yourself into sort of this Lebanese historiography?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a big question. No, it's good. So I don't want to inorganically like open up Lebanese history to insert the Armenians, right? Because if I believe that, then I would believe that there is something as authentic as Lebanese history that I'm trying to forcefully insert Armenians in. And it's not that. I think that by showing how Armenians have been left out, it also dislodges Lebanese national historiography, and actually dislodges Armenian historiography at the same time. And you're right that Armenians are not really there, or if they're there, they're either labeled as refugees or reference to the Armenian genocide, and then that sort of assumes that they're temporary. And I think that's done for particular reasons in order to construct a specific type of Lebanese historiography, and it sort of produces something on purpose, right? Purposeful. But I think it's also done purposely from the Armenian case as well, in that it connects Armenians to an outside place, or there might be an existential fear that if we discuss Armenians as intrinsically linked to Lebanon, then we are somehow minimizing the effect and the trauma of the Armenian genocide. And of course, there's a defensive reason for wanting not to do that, because there's still this this shroud of denialism, right? That I think people are still, that historians are obviously still engaged with. So I think that that's why there's a reason for it on both counts, unfortunately. I just don't think it needs to be the case. I think we can talk about the trauma of the genocide and talk about how Armenians are part and parcel of Lebanon's modern contemporary history as well, because they have been, right? We're not making it up. And we can do so, to expand Lebanese historiography. And I think that this also pierces Lebanese historiography in a specific way that it's particularly important, because I think that there's a lot of work done on Lebanon that likes to demonstrate that this is this abnormal state that shouldn't have been constructed, but it was, and it's always, there's perpetual sort of slide into violence. And I think that's one of the reasons why Armenians are left out, because they are not a great example of participating in this violence. I'm not so sure that this is actually accurate, but this is the how it's been represented. Because, so there is a support system, right? It's productive in nature. And I'm sort of wondering, I'm hoping that we can dislodge some of these understandings that we sort of take for granted that might be more comfortable, but are not actually historically accurate, right?
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
No, I appreciate you saying that it's not about an insertion but rather it is about a rethinking. So let's go to some of the audience questions here. Let's see. Where do we start? Hang on one second. Okay, Mano is withdrawing his question. He says it's redundant now. But let's start with Arakel. He says, thank you for your great talk. Can you speak a bit to whether the internecine conflicts among the Armenians persisted, or to what extent they shifted in the later civil war, 1975 onward?
Yeah, so that's a little bit out of my my zone, but I can speak a little bit about it. I think that we have colleagues that work actually on Lebanon during the Civil War, like Ohanes Guyukjan, who's at the American University in Beirut and Lebanese American University, who mostly talks about the fact that they're not really involved in the Lebanese Civil War. Now, as I mentioned in 1958, non-involvement demonstrates an involvement. So my reading of Armenians is a little different in that even through non-involvement, there is a type of involvement. And I think that it's also interesting to demonstrate what happens post 1975, and maybe even connecting to what's later on what happens in the Caucasus, right? Because you do have Armenians that have fought and engaged in the Lebanese Civil War, maybe not necessarily under the rubric of an Armenian political party, but under Lebanese political parties that do go on and fight in Artsakh. So there's also a specific connection between the people in Lebanon and also the Caucasus in the 90s because they're trained. I mean, it's urban warfare versus not, but the training does seem to help. So there is also a connection there as well. But I think that what you will definitely see, which comes also out of this period, is the consolidation of the power of the Dashnak party that really comes out of the 40s because of the success of the repatriation movement, that they are really able to consolidate their power. And if you look at it as protection, or if you look at it as fighting or neutrality, Guyukcan uses the term positive neutrality, that's still a type of power that is an outgrowth out of this time period.
That's really interesting. Can you talk a little bit more about the sort of process around the consolidation of neighborhoods, and how was this accomplished, sort of in a sort of very practical sense?
By force, also by discomfort of staying in that community or in that neighborhood, but also in the press, you really will read about the inability to enter neighborhoods at a specific time. So that means that they were blockaded, and that you needed the Lebanese army to even come in to take away bodies. And to access bodies to take them to the hospital and stuff. So it's quite physical and quite explicit. And in that way, and this did result in, you know, some type of internal displacement, or else the declaration that Edde is giving in the end of 1958, he wouldn't have mentioned that. So there's obviously a term, you know, a sense of displacement, or else it would not have been mentioned by the Minister of Interior, you know, that you know, that this shouldn't happen or people should return, right? So this also gives us a clue to that it was more than just a couple families.
Yeah. That's interesting. So Anush has a question. She says, thank you for your fascinating talk. My question is, how does the Lebanonization of Armenians figure into the Lebanonization of Lebanon as a whole? That is, how does the Lebanonization of Armenians in Lebanon relate to the Lebanonization of the multitude of other diverse communities within the country? Okay, I'm going to let you take.
So I think if I, and thank you, you know, all of you for your questions. It's really nice to see that it garnered interest. I think that, Anush, what you can also ask is, you know, how sectarian is the Armenian community, right? And I would answer that as pretty sectarian, and it needed to be, right? So it needed to be sectarian in order to articulate this type of power. And then thus it needs to be sectarian in order to defend and also maintain its level of power. So in that way, very it's very participatory in the Lebanization of Lebanon, if you understand that as sectarian, which it is. I mean, it's defined and you know, it is defined and defining as a sectarian system. So in that way, completely complicit and participatory. But in that complicity is actually where you see the demonstration of power. So it's not just that it's part and parcel of some mechanization. It also uses that mechanization in order to articulate its power. So it's multi-directional, right? Yeah.
Okay, I'm moving on to Vahe. He says, I agree with the perception of diaspora as being in between, not here and not there, obscure the actual experience of diasporic populations. As full members of their societies and as active participants of social political life in their countries. You mostly spoke about the ways in which the Dashnak party articulated belonging and loyalty to Lebanon and accused its rivals as disloyal and not belonging. Much in the same way as they did in the United States and elsewhere. But I wonder how the rivals, and I was going to ask that question, I wonder how the rivals, Hanchak and Ramgova, responded to these accusations of disloyalty, and how did they claim belonging to Lebanon?
Yeah, very similarly. Thank you for that question. I didn't get to go into it because I wanted to, in this talk, I didn't want, because I wanted to explain how how the Daşnak Party used the presidency as well. And that's different than how its rivals used the opposition. I would say less successfully. But vis-a-vis the rhetoric, it's actually quite similar. You'll see that it's quite funny also because there's also a continuity. I don't know if it's funny, haha, but there's a continuity from Ottoman times in that there's the same rhetoric as in a different way. So the Daşnak Party accused its rivals as being Turks because they're close to the Soviet Union, who has relationships with Turkey at the time, which, let's be a little sort of honest here, is a little bit of a stretch, considering the accusations that they made, that the Hınçak and the Namgabar parties made against the Daşnak Party for being allied with Turkey, given their support of the constitutional revolution during the Ottoman Empire, right? So it's interesting that that is also happening at the same time. So the accusation is the same, the way they are using it is different. And the way that one is using the Soviet Union, right? And one is talking, and one is using actual history of the, the constitutional movement. There's also a lot of cartoons at the time that the Hınçak and Ramgabar newspapers use more, to be honest. Astak doesn't really have cartoons so much, Zartunk does a lot. And the cartoon often shows the Daşnak Party as Nazi stooges. As well, mostly in the 40s, obviously, during the war, and literally the arm of the Turkish state as well. So the rhetoric is similar, it's just done in a different way. But the reason why I chose today to talk about the Daşnak Party's rhetoric is actually because of the way that I look at the relationship of specifically to the Lebanese state here. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So Mano is asking, what are some of the methodological practices that would guide a historian of the modern Levant tell the story of Armenians into, out of the region that gently challenges the established Lebanese Arab historiography and goes against the insular particularist nationalist Armenian historiography? So how it's a how question.
Yeah. In this talk, I really rely on the Armenian press, and that you can, and I mirror it with the Arabic press as well. But the Armenian press is so rich because, and so is the Arabic press. But the reason why I'm really talking about the Armenian press is at this time you have multiple dailies, weeklies. You have what's the word I'm looking for? Athletic organization newspapers and things like this, that you really have the richness of the publication circuit in the 40s and 50s. And it's been mostly untapped. So there are a few scholars that actually use the Armenian press, but not as much as I think that we can to really get an additional story. And what's interesting is you may think that it's really insular because who's reading this press, right? Only literate Armenians, and not everyone is literate in Armenian at the time, as in many Armenians are not even literate in Armenian at the time. And of course, Lebanese Arabs are not going to be reading this press. So you may think, oh, it's just this insular, form of communication. It is, and it's also not. And I think that, it's really something that we can rely on more, as well as with regards to other sort of case studies that I mentioned. I think you can also work on oral histories with regards to like the repatriation movement, but also personal correspondences from the political parties, and as well as personal correspondences between religious figures. And these are actually available through permission, but most researchers do have access to this material. I hope that answers the question of how.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
That brings me to the one part in your talk where the quotation said something along the lines, merely in Armenian characters. Can you expand on that? What were they referring to? Was it
Yeah.
sort of way of writing, or?
No, I think they were just sort of accusing that it happened to be an Armenian, but they weren't Armenian.
Oh, okay. So it's
right?
it's not that, you know, the language was any different or particular.
No. I think it was mostly like a veil. Like you may think that this person is Armenian because they say speak Armenian, but they're really not Armenian. So they're sort of de-Armenianifying them, right? And this rhetoric is used even today when you know on you know people who are talking about what's going on in Karabakh and Artsakh, like right, that these people are not Armenians or that they're traitors. Same type of rhetoric that's actually used in the 40s and 50s, but even before, like when I'm talking about the press and like as an extension of like the Nazis or an extension of the Turkish state in the 1920s, right? So it's really interesting that the representations are similar. People who are using them is different, and why they're using them is different, but the representations are certainly similar.
And did you do some ethnographic work with people who were deeply involved in these conflicts? Or?
I did, but I have to admit that's not what ended up in the work. So it was mostly for me to get a sense of the landscape, but it didn't end up, you know, maybe in another type of work in the future, but it didn't end up in this particular work. But it did help me get a sense that it was still a hot topic. And I'm actually still faced with that often. Maybe not today because we're not in a group situation, like it's not real, it's virtual. But I have had people speak to me that were either there at the time when I'm talking about a particular case, or have relatives or have heard about it. And it is really interesting and important to notice that it's still very much alive, even though, you know, we consider it history.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is something that's, I think, quite special in that when you work on something sort of relatively contemporary, that at times you may be faced with the fact that it's not so historical for many people. Yeah.
There are so many questions. Tsolin, we can take a couple of more.
I think we can take one or two more before I have to run. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, let's see. Ziad is saying, thank you for a terrific talk and for a great book. Looking back at our own training and research trajectories, I regularly regret not learning Armenian to take more seriously Armenian sources. How would you feel about the proposition that PhD students working in Lebanon need to always include Armenian language training in addition to Arabic and French, irrespective if they identify their project as related or not so to Armenian studies?
You know, that's a tricky question, Ziad. Thank you for it. I'm a little bit against forcing anyone to do anything. But I would like to get to a point where when we think about Lebanon, and I'm just using Lebanon as an example, that we also automatically think of Armenians. Just like when we think of Armenians, we also think automatically of Lebanon, right? So it's not like it's a one-way thing, because I don't think either is really done now. So I would also want, you know, people who work on Armenian studies to be well-versed and articulate in Arabic, right? Because I think that it's not just that, you know, Armenians have made an impact and continue to make an impact in the Middle East. So I think it needs to be done sort of on the multiple directions here, right? But I certainly think, yeah, it would be important. But I also think, I don't know, right? It's something I don't work on. But if I worked on Lebanon right now, like if I was an anthropologist, I don't know to what extent I would need to know like French. I don't know. So you may, right? It really depends on what your question is and what you're looking at. So that's why I say I don't want to make it, you know, a compulsory thing. But Yeah, but just like I really think Armenians who work on Armenian studies need to diversify and include other languages that clearly have made an impact upon whatever it is you're also looking at, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Well, thank you so very much.
Yeah.
Tsolin has to run.
Yeah.
As our life is complicated in these moments. But thank you all for coming, and I very much appreciated your talk, and I'm looking forward to much more of this in the future.
Yeah,
So
thank you so much.
everyone.
Yeah, and thank you to all who signed in and listened. So thank you so much, and thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
Our pleasure. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. Bye,
Okay, take
everyone.
care. Bye.